I remember one time we were at over at Briarwood, and they have this thing that there's somebody that comes around and they do, and I'm going to completely butcher it yesterday. So, but it's like there's one moment where you're doing this, and there's another moment where you're doing something else for whatever, or splitting the water. I really can't remember any of it, but there's a particular moment where everyone is supposed to raise their hands. And when everyone raises their hands, Harry Reeder went up and he took a picture of the crowd to say, I'm going to share this with all of my Presbyterian buddies to say, well, this is what we do at our Presbyterian church here. Just a typical Sunday, with all the hands raised. It was pretty funny. Okay. Well, I want to start off by talking about some unfinished items from Exodus chapter 1. We talked last week about how the story works kind of literarily, that it's scripture, it's history, but it's also literature. And so as it's told, it's a story that uses that literary motif of Pharaoh looking foolish. So from the moment that he says, we really need to smarten ourselves up, everything that he does is going to be foolish there. One of the things I didn't talk a great deal about is what exactly is the circumstance of the Israelites when they're descending into oppression and servitude under the Egyptians. We charted how in the first 7 verses of Exodus 1, the people have kind of spiraled out of control. They've gone down to Egypt. They knew who they were when they went down there. They have that sort of census organization. Everyone has names. They have their homes there. By the time we get to verse 7, it's no longer the case. There are a lot of people, but they've lost that sense of identity. And the word that's used there is the word sharatz, which means to swarm, which is not a positive term. It's kind of, I think the illustration I used was in when Bilbo invites everyone to his birthday party and invites a gross of people. It's not a good term to describe the people there. You just can't say the people are swarming in a positive fashion, especially since swarming things are not kosher in the Bible. They're saying there's a lot of people, but they're just lost. They're without a leader. They don't know who they are. And so they've lost some of that identity. What's going to be just as bad is the oppression that they begin to find themselves experiencing. It says in chapter 1 of Exodus, verse 11, therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramses for Pharaoh, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. So this is the moment when Pharaoh, eager to suppress the population of the people, decides to impose slavery on them. The challenge that we might have is thinking about what sort of slavery to be thinking of. There are 2 sort of basic ideas when you're thinking of slavery. One is that you can be chattel slaves, and the other is that you can be corvée slaves. So chattel slavery is when one person directly owns another person per year to the state, to where you're just a permanent, slave having to work for the state all the time. There's really no evidence that the Israelites were having to act as chattel slaves, where one particular Egyptian owned another particular Israelite. If you think about it, it never mentions how they're the personal property of some particular person. They're able to interact with the people. Remember, later in the Exodus, they're going to borrow some of the gold and silver items from the people and eventually take that with them when they leave. They're not the personal property of individual Egyptians. What they are is they belong to the state. And so Pharaoh has apparently decided that he's going to make the men work for him. There's actually no evidence that the women were slaves of the state. If you read through the text, it's just the men that are having to do this. Now, on the one hand, well, I don't know. It's like pick your poison. It's out of the frying pan into the fire. Which form of slavery would you prefer? Neither form of slavery is going to be good, obviously. There are pros and cons to each side. One of the negatives of chattel slavery is just the mere indignity that you belong to someone else. And so that's certainly something that, is reprehensible. On the other hand, if you are a chattel slave, you are valuable to the person who owns you. So if you're an individual Egyptian, You have a lot of money that's invested in the slave that you own, and so you have some incentive to make sure that no harm comes to them. I mean, this is one of the things that made slavery so difficult to unravel in the American South, was that people had their fortunes invested there, and the Britain ended up compensating the slaveholders, and that was one of the ways they were able to untangle slavery more easily in England than they were in the States here. So if you're a chattel slave, you have the indignity of belonging to someone else, but you also are worth something. And so there's an incentive for the slave master to care for you. If you're a state slave, you're not considered sort of the property of any other person any more than everybody's the property of Pharaoh. So you don't have that same indignity that's there. On the other hand, you're also not worth that much to the one who owns you, Pharaoh. As the line in the movie The Prince of Egypt says, well, they were only slaves. When he thinks about killing the kids, you're just one of many there. Now I'm going to use an illustration here. It's not intended to be provocative, but I hope it will illustrate the idea. To some degree, we have not chattel slavery, we still have state slavery even today. Now, we don't have it precisely right now, but many of you are old enough to remember, and certainly have relatives who were part of, what we might think of as a form of state slavery. It's the draft. Now, when the draft happens, you're forced to come and work for the state. You don't have a choice in this matter. You get your draft card, you're going to have to do it or face repercussion. You'll be a different kind of state slave if you don't submit to the draft there. So you belong to the state. Now, there's no sense that you are somehow subhuman. In other words, there's not that element of thinking that, well, as a soldier, I'm not of the same worth as someone else. You're considered fully human. On the other hand, there is an element of your life is not as valuable as it might be in other circumstances. We just, finished the 75th commemoration of D-Day. D-Day, I tear up just thinking of it, seeing the heroism. Boy, that guy, the 97-year-old who did the parachute jump, go get him. I mean, just when you read the stories of some of the things, particularly at Omaha, I can't get my head around it, frankly, the kind of carnage. In some sense, everyone knew if we send these people there, substantial numbers are going to die. So they didn't think of the soldiers as less than human. On the other hand, they did say, we're willing to sacrifice their lives for this cause. If you think about state slavery, those are some of the dynamics that Israel's experiencing. They're not viewed by the Egyptians as less than human. They're not viewed as the personal property of their neighbor. On the other hand, their lives are not that valuable. And so if you're going to make an omelet, you're going to have to break some eggs. If we're going to make a pyramid, well, some slaves may die. Some slaves will die, but that's just the way it has to be. This is what the Israelites are having to endure. And you can tell that as they're going through this, there is a kind of climax in the language of the suffering that they're enduring. It says in verse 13, the Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites. They made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks they imposed on them. One of the tasks that it's clear that they were involved in was brick making. And if you read the descriptions of how ancient brick making worked, it's a kind of drudgery that you wouldn't want to wish on anyone. We have actual, lists and documents. It's one of the strange things about the ancient world. Far more economic texts survive than great literary texts. We have more, just little receipts and transactions from ancient Mesopotamia than we do copies of the great, works of literature like the Gilgamesh epic or the creation epic. It's just, when you take it, you write it on clay and you bake it, it's like a brick. It lasts forever. And so we have tens of thousands of these. Many of them have never even been read that are there. Well, we have texts from Egypt that describe what brick making was like, where they had forms, they would put the mud into the brick, they'd mix it with straw, which acted a little bit like rebar in concrete wood. You let it dry for 3 days, you flip it over and you let it dry for 3 more days, and then you have a brick and you can make a structure out of it. Now, if you're going to make a monumental structure, normally what they use is stone. And so the pyramids, for example, they're these enormous granite blocks. We have a great picture of our son Samuel when he was 1 year old, sitting on one of the blocks of the pyramid there with our driver that we had whose name was Ali. Ali was great. Whenever Samuel would cry in the back, Ali would go, Sam, Sam, shut up. And, and almost every time Samuel would be quiet. So it was we wanted to just keep him with us for the rest of our time there. So there, the two of them, on next to the pyramids, it's still an experience. It's hard to I was there, I remember it, and yet it was so otherworldly to be at the pyramids. It was a neat thing. When you're going to make a monumental structure, the Sphinx or something like that, you use stone. When you're going to make a common structure like a house, well, that's when you would use mud bricks. Now, there is actually a pyramid that's made from mud bricks. It has declined tremendously compared to the ones that are made out of stone, but it's the Dock Shore pyramid, 24.5 million bricks in order to make this pyramid. Somebody was making this. This was the kind of labor that the Israelites would have been involved in. The documents that are preserved suggest that the quota per day for brick making was about 2,000 bricks. Now, I did the math. If you worked 10 hours a day, well, then you would have to produce a brick every 18 seconds if you were going to do that. Now, that doesn't account for, the mandatory union breaks that you were allowed and the lunch hour and so forth. If you bumped it up to 12 hours, well, that made all the difference in the world. You only had to make a brick every 21 seconds. And if you were willing, and I use the word willing in quotation marks, to work 14 hours a day, you had just a luxury of time, 25 seconds per brick. Imagine your life being every half minute you had to churn out a brick for 14 hours a day. When I went to seminary, and I think I've told y'all about this many times by now because I counted up, this is my 8th year of doing this. So all of my stories are, recycled. You've heard them before. If you will pretend that you have forgotten them, I will pretend that I've forgotten that I told you, and it will all work well. I put myself through seminary in 2 ways. One, by having a wonderful wife who worked, and 2, by working at UPS. And so I got up at 2 in the morning, every 5 days a week for 3 years. Worked from 3 until 8, and then went to school from there. In my bedraggled, haggard appearance, it was awful. If you've ever watched the program The Deadliest Catch, it was like that, but without the water. Same amount of profanity and injuries and everything else, but just without the ice. Well, I don't know. There was plenty of ice because it was in New York and it was cold, but UPS is a place that works on the basis of numbers. And many times I have had supervisors stand over me with a stopwatch. As they're counting, there's a certain number of packages that you have to put up onto the little rollers that are in the inside of the UPS semi-trailers. Because right down the middle of it, there's a set of rollers. You put the packages on there, and those go down one set of rollers and onto a conveyor belt, which leads to the sort. Life is much better. Your numbers go down because you're having to look at a package and remember what bin it goes into so that this giant conveyor will take it to the right spot. And then eventually you graduate up to where you're loading trucks. And so I had 4 trucks that I loaded every night, and I knew every street had a number for Spring Valley and Tom's Creek and all of these different places that were up in the lower part of New York there. And so I would go in. There was one time I had 3 nice tall trucks and 1 small truck. And I thought I was in the tall truck, and I was in the small truck, and I turned around, and it just decleated myself. I had a giant knot right on my forehead as I'm looking down, saying, I'm too stupid to walk around in public. I need a helmet. It was a numbers game, and the people counting us were under extraordinary pressure from the people who were counting them. It was all a numbers game. That's how this place works. They appointed taskmasters over the Israelites. Those Israelites are under pressure from somebody above them, and they're sending it right down with whip and lash to say, this is what you're going to do. And so it describes the Israelites as being under this kind of ruthless pressure. Now, we haven't hit the exact climax of their suffering. That won't come until the last couple of verses of chapter 2, and I'm going to save that for a while. But you can tell that their situation is growing increasingly dire. And added to the labor is the genocide. Pharaoh first asked the midwives to kill the children, and when the midwives refuse, albeit with a little bit of subterfuge in there, then he issues his edict to everyone and says, if there's a Hebrew boy, throw him into the river, kill him. They are reaching a point of desperation. And it's just at that moment when it seems like they have hit their nadir and things can't get any worse, that the story suddenly shifts from the suffering of the Israelites and over to this very familiar story at the beginning of chapter 2, Exodus chapter 2. Let me read a few months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him, plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. This must be one of the Hebrews' children, she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you? Pharaoh's daughter said to her, yes. So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him Moses, because she said, I drew him out of the water. Moses is introduced to us in this text. Moses is a towering figure in biblical literature. He is second only to Jesus in terms of importance in the biblical record. In fact, he's a character who is so important. I'll share with you a scholarly theory. I don't actually buy it myself, but it kind of indicates how important Moses is. You know, Moses dies in the most unusual fashion. In Deuteronomy 34, it says that God takes him up to the top of Mount Nebo and shows him the land of Israel and says, but you can't cross over into it. And it says, and Moses died there at the word of the Lord. In other words, God has taken Moses up to the top of the mountain and killed him, and then buries him. And it says, and no one knows where his grave is even to this day. And the people mourn over Moses. What some scholars suggest is that, well, that this is a cover story. That really what happened is the Israelites finally went through with what they said they were going to do many times along the way, and they killed Moses. It's one possibility. There's another possibility. Other scholars suggest that if you look closely at the stories of Moses and Elijah, there are tremendous parallels between the two. In fact, if you were in my prophets class that I teach at Sanford, I have a whole section where I show all of the different connections between Moses and Elijah. Their stories are told. The Elijah story is framed in the words of the Moses story there. And you remember how Elijah finally left the scene. That's when his fiery chariot came and he ascended into heaven on this. One scholar has suggested that that part of Elijah's story was also similar to Moses' story. That Moses was taken up onto Mount Nebo by God and then ascended into heaven with this fiery chariot. And it was deemed to be too much. If Elijah did that, it's no big deal. But Moses is a character of such importance that if he goes to heaven in that fashion, it's almost as if it begins to threaten monotheism. That Moses becomes a figure who's almost semi-divine in his doing this. No, we are not going to have Moses depart the scene in this fashion. Moses is going to die right there. Now, I don't necessarily buy that theory, but it gives you an indication of what they're saying about Moses. Moses is held in such high regard in the Bible that he is a character just beyond compare. You remember the scene where Miriam and Aaron challenge Moses in Numbers chapter 11? And God says back, you should have thought twice before you challenged my man Moses. When I speak to you, it might be through a vision or a dream. When I speak to Moses, I do it face to face. Moses is a character beyond compare in the Bible. And yet he will start off from the most humble and unlikely circumstances. Here in this passage, we hear the birth and eventually the adoption of Moses. But frankly, I think this is a story that is just riddled with questions. I have a list of them. Why does the text say at the beginning, a certain man from the house of Levi married a certain Levite woman? Do we not know this kid's parents? Why does it just say, oh, some guy married some woman and they had a kid? Why does it say, I really find this one to be odd, when she saw that he was a fine baby? This is not Sparta. We're not like culling the bad ones here. What are we're like sizing this kid up? Yeah, he'll do. And still you look at him and go, oh, look at him. I mean, there's a whole Seinfeld episode, you remember? Of the one where, the poor baby is hideous, and yet the mom is like, oh, isn't he beautiful? Why would it say when she saw that he was a fine child? It's a very odd line. Why in the world, why would someone get the idea that putting a kid in a basket and floating them down the river would be a good idea for preserving the child? Why does Pharaoh's daughter rescue him? How does she know that this is an Israelite child to begin with? Why does Pharaoh's daughter end up hiring out a nurse? Why does that nurse turn out to be Moses' own mother? And then why does she name him Moses? All of these oddities, I think they just pepper this text. In fact, I tell my students that their problem is they're too familiar with the Bible. And I mean that seriously when I say it to them, that they're so familiar with the Bible that they don't pay attention to it anymore. They have that experience of, you've all done this, haven't you, where you've been reading something and your mind has wandered so much that you eventually catch yourself and you look and you go, who's Miriam? And you're in some novel and you have to turn back page after page after page before you finally, it's like the main character of this chapter. But your mind has drifted off to some other place. It's that moment when you arrive in your driveway and you can't remember how you got there. You're sitting in the driver's seat, so you feel confident that you were the one who did it. I did actually leave and come to this place. It's because your mind has wandered. You've drifted off, and it's like when you were in college and the end of semester reading, and you really don't want to do it, and so something else just takes over your brain, and somehow the words, they're entering into your eyes. They might slip past the corneas. I doubt they make it to the optic nerve, but somehow you're reading the words, but you're not really reading them. And what you've got to do is something to arrest your attention. What I tell my students to do is just ask questions. You don't even have to answer the questions. But if you will just ask questions of things in the text that seem odd, it will stop you in your tracks and stop you from skipping over the top of the surface and actually reading the text. It's not the worst to me. And I decided that I had done it wrong, and I was correct in that appraisal. And so I decided to read it again, and I had a guide that I read along with it. And they picked out all of these different Christological connections and things like that, and the temptation that Peter has to experience when when Satan has asked to sift you, Peter, is the way the Gospels put it. Just questions. Why does this person have this name? Who is this person? When you just stop, it will cause you to appreciate the text far more. Why does the text do all of these things? I think some of the oddities in this text are things that just explain for us why the story of Moses clicks. Some, I think, are profound. David is a fascinating character. I don't know of a great movie production of David. For Moses, Moses is all over the screen. My goodness, Charlton Heston. I mean, this is just in that 12-hour long movie, The Ten Commandments, that he was in there. I mean, it's the defining role of his career. I remember when we went to Universal Studios when I was a teenager, and they had done a recreation of the sea parting, which our tour bus drove through there at the studios. Kind of lost a little bit of the punch from the movie there, but Charlton Heston was this incredible Moses figure in the Ten Commandments. The Prince of Egypt, this animated movie that was made about 20 years ago, it was a magnificent movie. I mean, they departed from the story in a few places. Of course, every movie does, but it had scenes in there that were just fantastic, because Moses is such a compelling character. And they continue to do it. Christian Bale was in a movie not long ago called Exodus, Gods and Kings. It's a story that gets told and retold. Where's the movie of Abraham? I know there probably is one, isn't there? It's Now there are. I mean, almost every character. You get Samson and Delilah and all of these. There was this wonderful time back in the 50s through the 40s and 50s when they made all of these movies for biblical characters and so forth. It's the ones that just continue to resonate. Moses is at the top. Why does his story connect with us? Well, let me walk you through it. Why does it say a certain man from the house of Levi and a certain Levite woman? One of the things of figures that often turn out to be larger than life is that they have a small role for their fathers. It's an interesting kind of dynamic if you look at stories. Heroic characters, larger than life characters, they often have a small role for their fathers. Abraham. Abraham is a huge character on the pages of Scripture. We know almost nothing about his father. Jacob. Now, Jacob would seem to be something that disproves this, because Isaac is a hugely important character, and yet he's not. Isaac is very important the entire time that he's promised and not there. And as soon as he shows up, they scuttle him right off the scene. In fact, he gets one chapter in the text to himself, and then they put him on his deathbed. And he doesn't die for another 10 chapters or so in the Bible, but as soon as he's there, he gets one chapter by himself, and then he's on his deathbed, seemingly just lingering for years and years to come, because he's replaced by Jacob. Abraham's important. We don't know much about his father. Jacob is important. We don't know much about his father. David. We know almost nothing about Jesse. Jesse just pops in out of nowhere. He's the father of a bunch of kids, is all that we know. Jesus. Think about Joseph. Joseph just disappears from the scene. How is that even possible? That in our stories of the Gospels, that by the time Jesus reaches his adult life, Joseph is apparently gone, and there's not a word to say about what happened to Joseph. Joseph just disappears, and they don't talk about him anymore. Even in figures that are prominent, I don't want to use the word heroic when I'm thinking just of presidents here, but if you think about how many of our presidents come from places where their fathers were missing characters. Bill Clinton, Ronald Reagan, Barack Obama, a lot of the people who end up becoming prominent, their fathers are missing characters in here. I think it's one of those little elements in here that clicks with us. It's very common for larger than life characters to be characters whose fathers are missing. We know what Moses' father's name was, Amram. And we know what his mother's name was, Yocheved. It's just not mentioned in this first chapter because they want the spotlight to be on Moses himself. Secondly, why is it that Yocheved would put Moses in a basket in the river? Well, it taps into a theme that is actually really common in ancient literature. It's the motif of the abandoned hero. You know a number of these. Hercules was abandoned by his mother Alcmene. Oedipus, one of the most famous stories from the ancient world, where Oedipus was left exposed on a mountain, and that's what leads to all of the terrible things that happen in the story of Oedipus. Romulus and Remus, actually pretty similar there. Romulus and Remus, these are the twins. They were put into a chest and thrown into the Tiber River. Cyrus, the great king of Persia, he was ordered by his grandfather to be left out on a mountain. And by far the most interesting of these, Sargon the Great. Sargon, well, his mother was from a priestly family. She conceived a son in secret. She put him in a basket of rushes covered with tar, put him into the river. The river carried him down to a place where a member of the royal household fetched him out of the water. He was raised by that person and he grew up to be a leader. That's a very similar story to what we find in the Moses story. Now, there are some significant differences, but the similarities are close enough that a lot of scholars say, well, the story of Moses is really not Moses' story. They just borrowed Sargon's story and then retold it with Moses as the person. You know, it's always possible, but I don't really find it all that convincing because of some of the differences. The key difference is that almost always the abandoned hero is a person of royal lineage who has been abandoned, and then they rediscover who they really are. Whereas with Moses, that's not going to be the case at all. He's going to be a nobody who turns into somebody. So how is there this similarity between the two? Well, I always pose this question to my students. Let's say you're being chased through the streets of New York City, and you turn down an alley, and that alley proves to be a dead end. What would you do? They immediately come up with all sorts of options. You could climb up the fire escape. That's one option. You could hide in a dumpster that's there. Or you could, and this is always the best one, you could lift a manhole cover and then you could hide in the sewers that are beneath, right? And I ask my students, well, is this something that you learned from your, extensive experience of being chased through the highways and byways of New York City or Chicago or something? And well, none of them. At least I've yet to have a student who was chased in such a fashion. How do they immediately know what to do? Well, they've seen countless movies where that's what a character did. Where does Yocheved get the idea that I could put my kid in a basket and send him down the river? I think the story of Sargon is the story that's there in the background for her. And so when she has to hide a child, well, what would you do to hide this child? And so what she does is she remembers this story from before, and so she puts her kid in the basket there and sends him down the river. I think that's probably where she gets the idea. This motif of the abandoned hero is one of the things that connects Moses with the great stories of ancient literature. Why is it that Pharaoh's daughter rescues him? It's rags to riches. Our story as Americans is the story of rags to riches. This is who we are. We think of ourselves as this upstart being condescended to by Europeans, and yet we end up, succeeding and so forth. And the story that we like in people like our politicians is a rags to riches story. We like those characters who come from humble beginnings and end up being great characters. I have a list here: William Wallace, Rob Roy, Joan of Arc, Maximus. If you're a Gladiator fan, we like these characters who come from nowhere and end up as a somebody. In fact, it's very difficult in our political scene to become, say, president if you don't have a rags to riches story. Now, this last election was just a complete, oddball in terms of most of our elections. But there's one reason why Mitt Romney never became president. He could never quite capture a rags to riches story. I don't care what your politics are. I'm not trying to make a political point. But he could never quite pull off a rags to riches story, and it made it difficult to connect with him. It's the reason he didn't end up winning. Politicians know that they need to create the aura of a rags to riches story, and so they try very hard to do it. I remember vividly one time George H.W. Bush at a Republican National Convention, and he said, and he pulled off his best Texas twang to do it. He said, "I remember when Barb and me were living," Barb and me were living in a trailer in West Texas. And what he was trying to do was, tap into that humble beginnings. Now, he didn't mention that they were living in that trailer supervising oil wells that he owned there in West Texas. But there was a reason for doing it. It was that you got to connect with that idea of rags to riches, the two ultimate rags to riches stories in the Bible are going to be Moses and Jesus. They are both people who come from incredibly humble circumstances. In fact, they come from the same humble circumstances. There are tyrants at the beginning of both of their lives attempting to kill them. They're miraculously preserved in Egypt, and then they are raised up to be these great characters. Rags to riches is another reason why this story connects with us. Why does Pharaoh's daughter name him Moses? Well, I mentioned this last week. It's foreshadowing and irony. Remember, she wants to just name the kid son, Mose, in Egyptian. What she ends up naming him is Moshe, which is how it comes out in Hebrew. And what Moshe means is he's the one who will draw out. In other words, he will, well, not be drawn out of the river, but he's the one who will draw his people out of Egypt. She practically gives him the name Deliverer. And that's what he'll end up doing, is delivering his people. The story just drips with foreshadowing. I think all of those elements in here are things that make this story connect and explain why the story is so popular. But there are oddities in this text that I think also have a more profound theological meaning. I want to talk about just two in the minutes that we have remaining. The first one, it has to do with that line when it says, "And when she saw that he was a fine baby." One of my perennial frustrations is when translators don't translate the text according to what the text says. We talked about this last week with the birth stool that was there. I won't delve back into what the birth stool is, but the birth stool has nothing whatsoever to do with the birth stool. It's Pharaoh explaining to the women how they can identify whether it's a male child who has been born. It says, when you see the two stones, it's a boy. Thank you, Pharaoh, for clarifying that to midwives. I'm sure they were quite familiar with such things. This text does not say, what does that sound like? It sounds exactly like the line that we find all through Genesis 1. Vayar oto kitov. Vayar oto. Read a text, and you hear an echo of some other work that's out there. When you hear that line, I've heard that before. There were a few years ago in a State of the Union address, George W. Bush said when he was talking about whether or not the government should fund faith-based organizations for charitable works, he says, because there's power, wonder-working power in these organizations. Now, I have no idea what your hymnody is like as Presbyterians, but I know that having grown up in a small, low church Protestant church, that talking about power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb was a hymn that I had heard my entire life. It was that kind of insider language that you hear, and you're supposed to go, okay, I caught that. When this text says, Vaterioto kitov, and when she saw that it was good, when she saw that he was good, your ears are supposed to perk up, and you're going, this is a creation text. God is about to do another act of creation. It's not the only creation element that's in this text. There's a joke that sometimes you'll hear where someone's trying to trick you. And they'll say, well, how many people were with Moses on the ark? Now, some of you didn't hear me say Moses. Your brains scurried along to the word Noah, and you're going, okay, there's Noah and Mrs. Noah, and there were the three sons and the three wives. And so you say, well, there's 7 people on there with them. Except that I said Moses, and they say, see, I got you. Well, there's a problem. When you ask how many people were with Moses on the ark, the correct answer is none, but it's not because Moses wasn't in an ark. The word that's used here for what Yocheved puts Moses in is not the word basket. She puts him in a teva. The word teva occurs 25 times in Scripture. It occurs in 2 contexts, Noah's ark and Moses' ark. Only 2 places in all of the Bible does it use this word. What Yocheved puts Moses into is the same thing that the story of the flood has God put Noah into. She puts him in a little ark so that he can be preserved through the dangerous waters. The story of the flood is a creation story. These are echoes of creation. This is a signal in this text that says, God is about to do a new work of creation. He's going to start with the creation of this young lad and turn him into the man he needs to be to lead the people. But he's also going to be starting a recreation of his own people. You remember I walked you through it. The people have spiraled to a place where they are now a chaotic mass. Creation in the Bible is not the creation of something from nothing. It's the creation of order from chaos. God has met a group of people in a place of chaos, and he is going to do a new act of creation. He is going to turn them into a people again who are now called by his name. Creation is one of the explanations for the oddities in this text. And then there is that other, and I think probably even more profound element in here. This is a demonstration of God's work behind the scenes. This is a story ultimately about God's sovereignty. How is it that this little lad survives a little boat ride down the Nile? I had to laugh when it was a bit of gallows humor, but we were in the Dallas airport for far longer than we wanted to be this past weekend. We were flying out to Yellowstone. In fact, I think I told y'all that we were going out to Yellowstone. We got to Dallas just fine, and then it became sort of like a terrible tragedy because we could never leave the Dallas airport. A terrible storm went through, and so there was a weather delay, and that pushed us until our 5:45 flight was going to leave at 8, but it's not the end of the world. And then our flight crew at 8 was still in Atlanta. And so even with the, gaining a time zone, it's not like you can just, snap your finger, but they were unable to. And yet they finally got the last member of the crew at about 12:15. And so we got onto the plane and we went out. And then there was a mechanical problem, and the pilot had to announce that we were going back to the gate. And so we went back to the gate, and then we saw the mechanics come onto the plane and off the plane and onto the plane and off the plane repeatedly until finally the pilot announced, "We're sorry, the flight is canceled. They'll take care of you out at the desk." They took care of us. We were fortunate. We managed to be second in line and actually got a flight for the next morning. Some of the poor folks were not able to leave until Tuesday from Dallas. We had no hotel. We were sleeping literally, like curled around these, barbarous kind of benches that they had. We never thought that we were going to be able to leave this airport here. But finally we did. We were safe. When we headed out there, how is it that we were able to somehow manage to survive in this? Well, how is it that Moses is able to somehow survive as this little lad on this trip in this dangerous river? Well, the point of my story of being in the airport is I was sitting next to a man who was from Egypt, and he was going to San Antonio. And there was a guy who said, "Oh, San Antonio's great. There's this river that's there. You should definitely go." And he said, "I don't need to see a river. I live next to the Nile." How does Moses make it through the Nile? It's because God is watching over Moses. How is it that of all places that this little boat manages to dock is going to be the place where Pharaoh's daughter happens to be going out bathing? It's because God is the one who's directing this boat to the right place. How is it that Pharaoh's daughter takes pity on this child who ought to have been killed instead? She could have just pushed him back out into the water. How is it that she takes pity on him? It's because God is moving even in the heart of Pharaoh's daughter to take care of him. How is it that Moses ends up perfectly placed to be the person to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, both raised in Pharaoh's household, and yet with a knowledge of his own people? It's because his sister had walked along and said, "Oh, would you like me to find a nurse for this little kid?" And so Moses' mother ends up being paid to be his mother and nurse the child so that he knows who he is. It's actually one of the elements of the Exodus movies that they always get wrong, that Moses doesn't know who he is in any of the movies. It's a complete surprise and shock to him. There's not a scent of evidence along those lines in the Bible. Moses knows his own people. He knows their suffering. It's one of the things that pains him and will make him go out to visit their sufferings. How is it that all of these things come together? It's because even in this darkest hour for Israel, God is working behind the scenes. And though his hand is not always obvious, it is always present as he's there working to make sure that what he wants to happen is what does happen. This is going to be the message of the rest of the book of Exodus. God is creating a new people, and his hand will always be at work, even behind the scenes when it doesn't seem obvious. As he says in our parlance, it's okay. I've got this. Just trust me. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for your word. We thank you for its beauty and for the way that it describes you as our God. We pray that you would help us to understand it better. In your Son's name, amen. Before you leave, when we first did our schedule for the times that I would be here, my son and I were supposed to be gone to Philmont for the next 2 weeks. Sadly, he ended up having to have knee surgery earlier this month, and while he's recovered a great deal, just didn't recover enough to be carrying a 40-pound pack for 100 miles out of the wilds of New Mexico. So the downside for y'all is that I'll be here for the next 2 weeks. So next week we're going to talk more about Moses and just one of the most wonderful sections, I think, of his life. But for the next 2 weeks I'll be here. So if you've seen a schedule that said there's no class, there is class. So I'm going to be delighted and privileged to be with y'all the next 2 weeks. So y'all have a great week.